This is direct order from superior officer under Joint Operations Protocol. That's what the Russian Marine Major shouted as he shoved past the checkpoint, pushing the Royal Guard's rifle to the side. But when Lance Corporal Mitchell finally broke protocol and stopped him cold, what he said in flawless Russian didn't just silence the room, it shattered the Major's entire sense of command. So what exactly did the Guard say that turned the confrontation on its head? First, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The amber glow of chandeliers bathed St. James's Palace in warm light as distinguished guests filtered through the grand entrance. Crystal glasses clinked delicately against the backdrop of measured conversation. Diplomats, military officers, and dignitaries from a dozen nations gathered for the International Military Cooperation Summit. Outside, the crisp London evening wrapped around the historic building like a velvet cloak, the night air carrying just enough chill to make the palace's warmth inviting. Lance Corporal Andrew Mitchell stood at his post with perfect stillness, his scarlet tunic a brilliant contrast against the ornate wood panelling near the entrance to the palace's restricted eastern wing. His white-gloved hands gripped his rifle with textbook precision, his eyes fixed forward in the disciplined thousand-yard stare that Royal Guards had perfected through centuries of tradition. 3 hours into his shift, not a muscle had twitched, not a bead of sweat had formed despite the warmth of the gathering. The reception had proceeded with choreographed British precision until the arrival of the Russian delegation's military attaché. Major Dmitry Baranov strode through the security checkpoint with the confident bearing of a predator entering new territory. His dress uniform bore the unmistakable decorations of Russia's elite naval infantry. The telltale blue striped shirt visible at his collar, campaign ribbons from Chechnya and Syria arranged with military precision. The slight scar tracing his left jawline added to the impression of a man who had seen combat up close and survived to wear its marks with pride. "Security here is like children's playground," Baranov muttered to his aide in Russian, not bothering to lower his voice as he handed over his formal invitation to be scanned. His eyes swept the hall with the calculated assessment of someone automatically identifying exits, security positions, and potential threats, a habit formed through years of Spetsnaz training. His gaze settled on Mitchell, and a dismissive smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "Look at this," he said, again in Russian. "They dress soldiers like dolls and expect them to be taken seriously." The security officer returned Baranov's invitation with a professional nod. "Welcome to St. James's Palace, Major. The reception is through the main hall." Baranov took the invitation without acknowledgement, his attention still fixed on Mitchell. "In Russia, we put our best men where they can be useful, not standing like statues for tourists." He straightened his already impeccable uniform and strode into the reception, deliberately taking a path that would bring him within arm's length of Mitchell. As he passed, he made a show of examining the guard from head to toe, his expression making clear his assessment, theatrical, not tactical. The contempt in his eyes would have registered with anyone watching. A military man who saw himself as a wolf among sheep, too experienced for such ceremonial nonsense. Mitchell remained perfectly still, his discipline unbroken by the Russian officer's scrutiny. If he registered Baranov's dismissive assessment, nothing in his bearing revealed it. Behind him, the restricted wing of the palace remained secured, the barrier between public ceremony and private diplomatic functions maintained by nothing more apparent than a man in a scarlet tunic. 20 minutes into the reception, Major Baranov appeared at the entrance to the restricted east wing, a half-empty glass of scotch in his hand. The Russian checked his watch with exaggerated impatience, then approached the regular security officer stationed at the electronic checkpoint. "My delegation is meeting with your defense minister in the Wellington room," Baranov stated, the words more demand than information. "I need to join them." The security officer checked his tablet. I don't see your name on the clearance list for that meeting, sir. Only Ambassador Petrov and Colonel Yashin are authorized. Baranov's expression hardened. There has been change of plans. I am now required. I'll need proper authorization, Major. Perhaps your ambassador could call down. This is ridiculous bureaucracy, Baranov cut him off, turning away without waiting for a response. His eyes locked onto Mitchell's post, the most visible symbol of British protocol, and his lips curled into a thin smile. He approached with deliberate steps, positioning himself directly in the Royal Guard's peripheral vision. For a moment, he simply observed, sipping his scotch with calculated nonchalance. Then, without warning, he raised his phone and snapped several photos, the flash deliberately bright. "Smile for Russian Military Academy," Baranov said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "We show cadets how not to use elite soldiers." He turned to a passing waiter. "You, take photo of me with this, what do you call it, toy soldier?" The waiter hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "Sir, we generally don't disturb the Queen's Guard." "Is not disturbance, is documentation." Baranov handed his phone to a reluctant American military attaché instead, positioning himself beside Mitchell with an arm outstretched as if displaying a museum exhibit. In Moscow, this would never be permitted. Security is serious business, not tourist attraction. The American took the photo quickly and returned the phone, moving away with evident discomfort. Baranov examined the image, nodding with satisfaction. Perfect example of Western military priorities. Very colourful. Very useless. A small group of guests had begun to notice the Russian officer's behaviour, creating subtle distance while watching with diplomatic caution. Baranov seemed to relish the attention, raising his voice further. "In Spetsnaz training, we stand motionless for days in snow, not in heated palace. This is what makes Russian soldiers superior. We train for combat, not ceremony." He circled Mitchell slowly, like a tailor examining a mannequin. "Uniform very pretty, bearskin hat very tall, but in real combat, first target for enemy." He made a pistol shape with his fingers, pointing it at Mitchell's hat. "One shot, very visible." Mitchell remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed forward with unwavering discipline. The slight flutter of a ribbon on his uniform was the only movement as Baranov deliberately stepped closer than protocol allowed. The Russian placed his empty glass on the small table that marked the boundary of the restricted area, directly in Mitchell's peripheral vision. "Hold this for me, Da, since standing still is your specialty." A few nearby guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but diplomatic protocol kept them from intervening with the Russian officer. Baranov checked his watch again, his frustration visibly growing at Mitchell's perfect composure. He had expected some reaction by now, a twitch, a glance, some hint of humanity breaking through the ceremonial facade. The guard's discipline was proving more formidable than he had anticipated. "Your Ministry of Defence should thank me," Baranov announced, leaning against the wall beside Mitchell's post. "I am providing free security assessment. First recommendation: replace ceremonial guards with actual security." He pulled out his phone again, making a show of taking notes. "Second recommendation: train soldiers to respond to changing conditions, not stand like furniture." Mitchell's thousand-yard stare never wavered, his discipline a silent rebuke to the Russians' increasingly obvious provocations. As the evening progressed, Baranov's attempts to provoke a response grew more deliberate. He returned from the main reception with a fresh drink, positioning himself directly in Mitchell's line of sight. "You know, in St. Petersburg Naval Infantry Museum, we have display of British uniform from Crimean War," he said conversationally, as if Mitchell had engaged him in discussion. "Very similar to what you wear now. This tells you everything about British military thinking, unchanged since 19th century. He sipped his drink, eyes narrowing as he studied the guard's unwavering focus. Moscow Military Academy teaches us about psychological warfare. Standing motionless while being addressed? This is attempt at psychological dominance, yes? Unfortunately for you, I wrote dissertation on breaking enemies' mental discipline. A senior British Army officer, passing nearby, slowed his pace, registering the Russian's inappropriate behaviour with a frown. Baranov noticed and elevated his performance. "Colonel," he called out in English, "perhaps you explain to me why station elite soldier as photograph opportunity. In Russian military, we would consider this waste of training resources." The British officer paused briefly. "The Queen's Guard are operational combat soldiers, Major. Their ceremonial duties rotate with active deployment." His tone was professionally neutral but carried unmistakable coldness. "Combat soldiers who cannot respond to direct address?" Baranov scoffed. "This is effective training model?" "Their discipline speaks for itself," the officer replied before continuing on his way. Baranov turned back to Mitchell with renewed focus. "Your colonel abandons you to harassment. In Russian unit, commander would never permit this." He stepped closer, deliberate intimidation in his posture. "But perhaps you are not really soldier. Perhaps you are actor hired for tourists." He pulled out his phone, making a call while maintaining uncomfortable proximity to Mitchell. "Alexei, Dmitri here. You would not believe security at British Palace. They have costume performer blocking access to diplomatic areas." He laughed loudly. "Da, like in Kremlin Museum. But here they pretend it is real security measure." Another guest approached the security checkpoint, presenting proper credentials to access the restricted wing. Baranov watched the standard procedure with calculated interest, then abruptly ended his call. "Excuse me," he addressed the regular security officer loudly. "There has been message from Russian ambassador. I am now required in meeting." "I'll need to see your clearance, sir," the officer responded evenly. "My clearance is that I am Major Dmitry Baranov, Special Military Advisor to Ambassador Petrov." He produced his standard credentials rather than the required security clearance. "This should be sufficient." "I'm sorry, sir, but specific clearance is required for the diplomatic wing. Perhaps if the ambassador calls down." "This is deliberate obstruction," Baranov declared, raising his voice to ensure nearby guests would hear. "Political game to exclude Russian delegation from important discussions." The security officer maintained his professional composure. "The same protocol applies to all delegates, sir. No exceptions." Baranov turned away with theatrical disgust, making directly for Mitchell's position again. He positioned himself squarely before the guard, deliberately blocking his line of sight, a third violation of the clearly posted protocols. "Your British bureaucracy is why empire collapsed," he announced loudly. "While you stand perfectly straight, world changes around you." He produced a cigarette, making a show of searching for a light, despite the obvious no-smoking signs. "Perhaps that is why you don't move. If you don't see change, you can pretend it isn't happening." A palace attendant approached discreetly. "Sir, this is a non-smoking area." Baranov tucked the unlit cigarette behind his ear with a dismissive gesture. "Another rule. Britain drowning in rules, while real-world powers take action." As the attendant withdrew, Baranov's attention fixed on Mitchell's rifle. "Is this even functional weapon? Or is it theatre prop, like your position?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a threatening quiet. "In Spetsnaz, we learn 14 ways to disarm guard without setting off alarm. Should I demonstrate, or would that finally make you move?" The reception hit its peak, the grand hall now filled with the pleasant hum of diplomatic conversations, punctuated by occasional laughter. Most guests had settled into the comfortable rhythm of international networking, exchanging carefully measured insights over champagne and canapés. Near the entrance to the restricted wing, however, the atmosphere had grown noticeably tense. Major Baranov had acquired another drink, his fourth by the subtle count of palace staff, and his facade of diplomatic restraint had worn increasingly thin. His voice had grown louder, his gestures more expansive, and his attention remained fixated on Lance Corporal Mitchell, whose disciplined stillness seemed to offend the Russian officer on some fundamental level. "You know why Russian military achieves objectives while NATO holds meetings?" Baranov announced to no one in particular, though his voice carried to nearby guests. "Because we select soldiers who respond to changing conditions. Man who stands still when situation changes is not disciplined, he is obsolete." He turned to an uncomfortable French naval officer who had paused nearby. "You served with Russian joint exercises in Mediterranean, yes? Did you see Russian Marines standing like furniture during operations? No, because we are combat force, not tourist attraction." The French officer nodded politely and moved away without engaging, but Baranov had already turned back to Mitchell. "Let me explain something about international military protocol," he said, adopting the tone of a lecturer addressing a slow student. "Across all NATO and Partnership for Peace exercises, there exists universal understanding about chain of command. When superior officer from Allied force addresses you, minimal courtesy is to acknowledge." Baranov stepped closer, deliberately invading the space that palace regulations clearly marked as restricted. "I am Major Dmitry Baranov, Russian Naval Infantry, veteran of Crimea and Syria operations, special warfare instructor at Advanced Military Academy. My operational experience alone demands professional courtesy." Mitchell's eyes remained fixed forward, his discipline unbroken, despite the Russians' increasingly aggressive proximity. "This is no longer amusing." Baranov's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "Your disrespect to Russian Federation military representative becomes diplomatic issue." A small crowd of observers had gathered at a cautious distance, the confrontation now impossible to ignore. Among them, several military officers watched with professional interest, assessing how the situation would resolve. "Last month, your SAS trained with our special forces in international counter-terrorism exercise," Baranov continued, his words carrying the precision of someone building a formal complaint. "They showed proper respect to Russian officers. Are palace guards exempt from military courtesy? Or are you simply not real soldier?" Mitchell's silence had become a palpable force, his stillness more imposing than any movement could have been. The contrast between his perfect composure and Baranov's increasingly agitated state was striking. "Enough theatre," Baranov suddenly declared. He produced an identification card that he thrust toward Mitchell's face. "This grants me access to all diplomatic functions at NATO Level 3 clearance. Your security officer is being deliberately obstructive due to political tensions. As military professional, you must recognize legitimate authority." The card, when briefly visible to others nearby, was clearly not the required security clearance, but rather a standard military identification, a distinction that wouldn't be obvious to casual observers, but would be immediately apparent to security personnel. "I have urgent intelligence for Russian ambassador regarding joint operations. Delay creates security risk." Baranov's voice had taken on the clipped tones of battlefield command. "You will permit me to pass." Mitchell remained motionless, his disciplined stance unbroken. "This is direct order from superior officer under Joint Operations Protocol." Baranov's patience had clearly reached its limit. In any military organization, chain of command supersedes local procedure during security situations. With deliberate movement, Baranov reached forward and placed his hand on the barrel of Mitchell's rifle, attempting to move it aside. "You will acknowledge, superior officer, and permit passage to diplomatic area now." The change in Lance Corporal Mitchell's demeanour was so precisely controlled that observers later described it as mechanical in its perfection. One moment he stood in ceremonial stillness, the next, his white-gloved hand moved with fluid efficiency to remove Baranov's hand from his rifle. "Major Baranov," Mitchell spoke, his voice carrying the crisp articulation of British military precision. Touching a Queen's Guard's weapon constitutes a Category 1 security violation under Palace Protection Protocol 157. Baranov's expression shifted from commanding to momentarily stunned. He clearly hadn't expected any verbal response, much less one delivered with such unapologetic authority. Furthermore, Mitchell continued in flawless Russian, your credential is standard military identification, not diplomatic security clearance. Attempting to use it to gain unauthorized access constitutes a deliberate security breach. The shift to Baranov's native language visibly jolted the Russian officer, who took an instinctive step backward. While your rank would normally command appropriate respect, Mitchell continued, his disciplined bearing never wavering, St. James's Palace protocols establish clear jurisdiction. The Queen's Guard operates under direct royal authority, not within standard military chain of command while on palace duty. Mitchell's stance remained precisely aligned with ceremonial requirements, even as he addressed the situation. Your actions have been logged as potential security incidents. Inappropriate proximity to guard position, attempted credential misrepresentation, and unauthorized contact with security equipment. You cannot speak to me this way, Baranov sputtered, genuine shock breaking through his commanding facade. I am Russian naval. I am aware of your service record, Major, Mitchell interrupted with calm precision. Just as you should be aware that I completed 3 tours with 40 Commando before my Royal Guard assignment, including joint operations with Russian forces near Latakia in 2019. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Baranov's expression cycled through shock, reassessment, and growing awareness that he had catastrophically misread the situation. Palace security has been monitoring your behaviour since arrival, Mitchell continued, his tone remaining professionally neutral despite the content of his words. Further attempts to access restricted areas without proper clearance will result in your removal from the reception and formal diplomatic notification. For a moment, the confrontation hung suspended in perfect stillness. Baranov's face had flushed deep red, a muscle working furiously along his jawline as he struggled to process his sudden reversal of fortune. The disciplined Royal Guard, who had seemed nothing more than a ceremonial obstacle, had just systematically dismantled his authority, his credentials, and his assumptions, all while maintaining perfect military bearing. This is outrage, Baranov finally managed, his accent thickening with anger. I will report this treatment to Ambassador Petrov. There will be formal complaint. Mitchell's response was measured and precise. That is your right, Major. I should inform you that video surveillance has recorded all interactions at this checkpoint. My commanding officer will provide complete documentation should any diplomatic inquiry arise. The subtle emphasis on complete documentation carried unmistakable meaning. Baranov's behaviour throughout the evening would not withstand official scrutiny. You deliberately provocate Russian officer, Baranov attempted, his composure cracking further. Standing silent when addressed is insult in any military. Standing orders for Queen's Guard are quite specific, sir, Mitchell replied evenly. Our primary duty is to the Crown, which includes maintaining prescribed position and bearing regardless of provocations. This isn't disrespect to your rank, but rather respect for the oath of service I have sworn. Baranov opened his mouth to deliver another retort when a hand firmly gripped his shoulder from behind. Major Baranov. The voice was quiet, but carried unmistakable authority. Colonel Lebedev, the senior Russian military representative, had materialized behind his subordinate. Your presence is required elsewhere. Baranov turned, momentarily thrown off balance by his superior's sudden appearance. Colonel, this guard has shown disrespect to... We will discuss this privately, Lebedev cut him off, his eyes flicking briefly to the small crowd of observers. Now. Understanding dawned in Baranov's expression. The realization that his behavior had created exactly the kind of diplomatic spectacle Russian leadership had specifically warned against. Whatever his personal feelings, the public confrontation had become a liability to his country's interests. "This is not concluded," Baranov muttered to Mitchell, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. Colonel Lebedev guided his subordinate firmly away from the security checkpoint, his expression professionally neutral, but his grip on Baranov's arm communicating volumes. As they moved through the reception, several guests subtly adjusted their positions to observe the aftermath, diplomatic training preventing any obvious attention. Near the main entrance, the Russian ambassador waited, his face a careful mask that nevertheless failed to completely hide his displeasure. The brief exchange between ambassador and major was conducted in hushed tones, but Baranov's stiff posture and the ambassador's curt gestures told the story clearly enough. Moments later, Baranov was escorted from the palace, his participation in the evening's diplomacy conclusively terminated. Back at his post, Lance Corporal Mitchell had resumed his ceremonial position with perfect precision. If the confrontation had affected him in any way, his bearing gave no indication. The 1,000-yard stare was fixed in place once more, his white-gloved hands holding his rifle with textbook steadiness. The security officer at the electronic checkpoint gave Mitchell a subtle nod, professional acknowledgement between security professionals that went unnoticed by most observers. Nearby, a German colonel whispered something to his American counterpart, both glancing with newfound respect at the scarlet uniformed guard they had previously regarded as merely decorative. Throughout the remainder of the reception, no other guests attempted to access the restricted area without proper clearance. The Royal Guard's ceremonial appearance had proven to be not a vulnerability, but rather an asset, the perfect disguise for genuine security capability, hiding professional vigilance behind ceremonial tradition. As the evening progressed, conversation returned to diplomatic pleasantries and careful negotiations. If the Russian delegation felt the absence of their military attaché, they gave no public indication. The incident had been contained, the potential diplomatic friction minimized, and the palace security protocols maintained, all through the precise application of discipline by a guard most guests had assumed was merely standing still. In the subtle calculus of international relations, appearances had proven deceiving on all sides. The ceremonial guard had revealed himself as a combat veteran with perfect diplomatic awareness. The decorated Spetsnaz officer had exposed himself as diplomatically unreliable. And the seemingly rigid traditions of the Royal Guard had demonstrated their practical effectiveness in modern security operations. As the reception drew to a close, the last guests filing out into the London night, Lance Corporal Mitchell remained at his post, his discipline unbroken. Tomorrow, the diplomatic world would continue its careful dance of international cooperation. The Russian delegation would adjust its approach, the palace would maintain its protocols, and the Royal Guards would continue their centuries-old tradition of standing perfectly still, watching everything, missing nothing, and responding with precision when duty required. Have you ever witnessed someone completely misjudge a professional based on appearances alone? What's the most impressive display of discipline you've seen when someone was faced with blatant disrespect? If you enjoyed this Royal Guard story, hit that like button and subscribe to see new stories daily. Don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss our uploads. Share this with someone who appreciates professionalism under pressure. Check out our other Royal Guard stories appearing on your screen now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another compelling story.